Well, I was one of four children, and my father was attached to Anacostia Naval Air Station in Washington, D.C. And I was born in '43, and he was at the Anacostia Naval Air Station on July of '52. I remember this later because of a lot of reports, and when I was a young kid with my brothers and sisters, on this one particular night, it was in the summer and it was a very clear night. There weren't any clouds in the sky. There wasn't any lightning or anything like that. And we lived fairly close to the Potomac River. And these lights came up the river. They were like sparklers. There were giant ones. There were amber ones. There were kind of a bluish color and white color. And they floated over the trees very quietly. Some of them moving slow, some moving fast, kind of like soap bubbles. But they weren't moving according to the wind or anything. They weren't balloons that were lighted or anything like that. And this went on for about a half an hour. And then we heard some kind of a horn, and then all of a sudden saber jets were coming up the Potomac River chasing these things. And they'd go, some of them went straight up and out of sight, and then some of them just went, you know, they just left. And I was out in the yard. We had a kitchen garden in the backyard, and we had a star planter with roses in it, and I was always, in those days you had to push a lawnmower and sharpen the blades, a Sears lawnmower, because you didn't have gasoline lawnmowers then. And I was out actually mowing the yard and trimming at the time. And I saw these things, and I ran inside and got my brothers and sisters to come running out. My grandmother was living with us at the time, and my father was on air station duty down at the Anacostia Naval Air Station. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. And the thing that reminded me of this mostly was when I saw the movie Close Encounters, the hair kind of stood up on the back of my neck because those little light balls that came through the toll gates on the freeway reminded me exactly of what I saw when I was a little kid. I alluded to these later with Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr., whom I contacted because he was about the same age, maybe a little older, when he saw the pieces his father brought home in the back of the car. And we've conversed on that quite a bit since then. These objects tied in with, in later years, when I began to read about the famous flyover in 1952 in Washington, D.C., and I put two and two together, and I was there and saw those at that time, from newspaper articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times. At that time, Life magazine had articles on that, and I think they even had some pictures. And when I was studying later in college, I tried to look up some of this stuff and couldn't find it, but I have some copies of some of these magazines and articles from my father-in-law, who had kept just about everything in his boxes. When I was in high school, I enlisted in the military service. Our family didn't have a lot of money, and after I enlisted, I went through classification in Norfolk, Virginia, and they sent me to the aircraft carrier USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. I had spent time in boot camp up in Great Lakes, Michigan, and I had spent a total of 6.5 years in the United States Navy. And I was honorably discharged in 1967, and I was a petty officer at the time. When I first went into the service, I picked up the USS Roosevelt in 1962 in Palermo, Sicily. She was at anchor in Palermo, Sicily. And I came on board as a radar operator. I was trained in OI Division, which is Operations Intelligence Division. But it took me a year to get my classified clearance to work on certain radar and electronic countermeasure equipment. I was trained in Newport, Rhode Island. When the ship was put into Bayonne, New Jersey for some new equipment to come on board, the Roosevelt was used as an experimental ship for installation of new electronic equipment, new types of radar, electronic countermeasure, you name it. And also we had some other new type of aircraft come on board the Rosie. My cruise book is from 1962 to 1963, and I had no prior knowledge of anything about UFOs following the Roosevelt or anything else when I first came on board. I was 19 at the time when I boarded the Rosie, and I spent half my first med cruise on board and all of the second med cruise. I extended, as a matter of fact, my active duty service several months so I could come back with the ship, my second med cruise. And when I went up to OCS in Newport, Rhode Island, they trained us on the state-of-the-art radar equipment. The Russians were playing war games of their own. They would kind of harass the fleet and they would try flyovers. The Saratoga was flyover, to explain that. Russian Bear aircraft, very fast, very high-flying turbo aircraft. They got like 8 props on them. And they would do flyovers, and they would monitor our electronic emissions to try to figure out what kind of electronic warfare they could do. And I had detected, in fact, I got a commendation for detecting a Russian Bear aircraft from Commander Gibson at that time. And so we were particularly on watch for this. My job was to be able to challenge. I knew what commercial aircraft were. I could check their, is it friend or foe signals or stuff like that. I knew about the tactics the Soviets used. Soviet military aircraft would get into commercial air corridors and try to be masked by the IFF squawk from the back of commercial aircraft. I was on mid-watch during my second med cruise, and it was about sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock, and I had a contact come on the radar scope. This new radar that we had a SPA 50-inch repeater. We used to have SPA 8s and a VG, a vector guide that we plot aircraft on. And I knew the difference between surface search radar and air search radar. There's differences in polarity of the radio signal and things like this, and how the waves come back, all the stealth kind of stuff, you know, active and passive electronic countermeasures. So I know the difference between a flock of geese, or, you know, wave returns, or false echoes, we could generate false signals. Part of my job was to generate false signals to midshipmen that would come on board to Roosevelt for training on radar equipment, to see if they could tell the difference between an internally false signal that's generated and a real signal on the radar scope. And in fact, this was the first thing that challenged me to check it out in ECM as to whether or not the contact that I had on the scope was genuine. Because this was between 65,000 feet and above, and the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge. It was got my attention, and the attention of others that were on watch. There were 4 enlisted on watch and 2 officers at the time that this occurred. We challenged it and checked the codes out. It was not commercial, and then it began to move. Fairly slowly at first, and then very quickly. It was doing better than 1,000 knots. The first time I picked it up, it was hovering, it was stationary. Then it was doing about 1,000 knots. Then we contacted, it was over 500 miles away. And that high up, even though horizon line is at 18 miles on the Earth, when you have that high in altitude, you can detect aerial contacts at a much greater distance than line of sight, or UHF, let's say, communications. And so anyway, in this particular case, it was showing up on height-finding equipment, and it was showing up on radar equipment. The CO came in, and he wanted to know what the heck was going on here, and they looked at it and asked what the hell was that, you know, and it got the attention of the captain at that time. Was Captain Clark, was my captain. My commander was Commander Gibson at the time. And there was only one person on watch in ECM. And before I knew, in a matter of 15 minutes, the ship was being turned, and 2 Phantom IIs were being prepared for launch. Now, I got on a set of headphones, and I'm on a SPA 8 repeater now, and I'm listening to communications between the pilot and the CO flight ops. And when you go to general quarters, you do the same thing, and I was used to doing this because one of my jobs during general quarters was to sit right next to the commander of our division and to listen to the cap aircraft, and my job was to log in all the tally-hos and everything. My job was as recognition expert also to be able to identify different types of Navy ships, foreign ships, commercial ships, maritime ships, and aircraft, not only electronically but visually, be familiar with electronic fingerprints. In any event, the Phantom IIs went to afterburners, and they were about 100 miles or so away from this contact and turned on the conical scan radar to lock on, and it winked out. Just disappeared. I could see the 2 Phantom IIs on my scope, and this thing winked out. They flew around for about 10 minutes, and then they headed back to the ship. Now understand, this is normally they spot aircraft on the deck, but they always keep the side ramp, you can launch 3 catapults on the Roosevelt. You can launch 2 forward catapults were, at this time, were occupied with aircraft spotted on the deck, and they launched these Phantom IIs off the angled catapult, and then they recovered them. And after they recovered them, about 35 minutes later, after they land on the pipe, 35 minutes later, and everybody's settled down, this thing winks back on again, and it's about 12 to 15 miles from the ship, hovering at about 30,000 feet. It's a clear night, stars are out, and the lookouts, I can talk to them on my headphones here. Everybody's connected. Your air plotter, your surface plotter, your officer, your flag plot, the captain or whoever the officer of the watch is up in the conning tower. And on an aircraft carrier, this is very serious business because you have a lot of people involved and a lot of safety factors involved, and so it's not a normal thing just to fire things up that quick. And in any event, they went out and the lookouts couldn't see anything. Nobody could see anything, but it was there on our radar scope. It was not a false signal. I never saw anything. I never left mine, but all I could hear were the reports coming over my headphones. And then the thing that really startled me the most was that after I got a break, we'd get, they're pretty diligent about this in the Navy even today, is that you'd get breaks, at least a 10-minute break in every hour of watch because they want to keep you fine-tuned. And so I went down the corridor, and for this time, for the first time, I saw 2 armed Marines there. 2 Marines there, the one that usually stands with the captain, and they're outside ECM, and they wouldn't let me in there, and I had a clearance to be in there. And then I saw other officers there whom I'd never even seen before. So something went down. Went down to eat breakfast after midwatch. A lot of the Airedales were down there talking about, the weird operation that night and what had happened. And of course, I couldn't say anything, and I didn't say anything because I was told by my CO that, and I was reminded of this when I saw the movie Red October. And the admiral walks up and shows somebody the credentials and say, "This never happened." And my CO told me, "Jordan, this, what have you got in your log? This never happened." And I wasn't the only one there on watch that night. So anybody who was there at that time knows what I'm talking about and knows that it's the truth. But less than a dozen people knew what went on that night, and that ship had 5,000 men on it. A few of us started talking about it, and I later ran into a Navy chief at the school up in OCS who told me a story about when he was down in the Caribbean. And they had a GQ, and they were on operational readiness inspection with the ships, and they saw this large UFO come up out of the water and take off. And he said that the movie The Abyss was based on that particular story, and that was a part of the Navy records. I've since contacted many of my shipmates because of everything that's been going on with UFOs lately, and which brings up some other subjects, but which I'll get into in a minute. But I have been in touch with Mr. Chet Grzinski, who had been a tremendous help and had sent me some of the papers that I saw when I had first gotten my clearance about reporting UFOs and things like this. It was called GENAP. It was standing orders of the day. If you had detected anything, how to report it. It was primarily for radio operators. I was flag plotter when the admiral would come on board for 6th Fleet and use it as his flagship, or some other CO in charge of it. And so I don't take claims about UFOs very lightly, and it makes you kind of nervous when you have these things happen, in your life, and you're a little skittish about talking about it with people because they probably think you're bouncing balloons off the wall or something. But people cannot know what they themselves have yet to experience. In this case, the contact was not leaving any kind of a heat signature. It was not leaving any kind of a trail. It was not moving at a speed which was proportional to the normal antenna rotation rate, given the contact signal coming back on the vector guide, given the plot, given the minutes I was making the fixes in 30 seconds. This thing was moving 10, 15 miles in 30 seconds, 20 miles, then 30 miles, then 40 miles, then 100 miles. And in virtually 3.5 minutes, this thing moved, almost 500 miles. And then moving from one altitude to another that would cause any normal pilot to black out, let's say, was very strange to me. Signal from this contact at that distance and that altitude was sending back a signal as strong as the Roosevelt itself, and the Roosevelt was over 1,000 feet long. But it was a lieutenant commander whom I didn't know very well. He hadn't been on board very long, and he came over and he asked, what was up, Jordan? What do you got in your log? And he says, you don't need to put that in there. It's basically the gist of it. And now, to me, that was highly irregular to say that, particularly in ship's logs. I did have the contact logged in there. And here we had all this stuff going on. Never another word about it.
And so it was not recorded anywhere on the ship?
As far as I know, unless it's in the captain's log.
You could say
or unless it's in the division commander's log. But I've heard during the STS-48 mission, while they were in orbit, and I was listening on the ham radio, and I have an Omni antenna on house, and then I also have other ham friends around the country, some of them former Navy too. And the astronauts were talking about, we have the UFO under observation, and then I've heard them say, we have the alien spacecraft under observation. When Blaha was up, and that audio had became a part of several videotapes, I was one of the ham operators. I did hear that. In fact, I called Jack, Dr. Casher, about that, a friend of mine who had a son going to school where I teach. And I told him they're talking about alien spacecraft. They actually use that term over the airways. And it just stunned me. It just stunned me. Now, get this. This is remarkable. During the STS-48 mission, during all that flap, and then the word got out, and I was in touch with a friend of mine, Vince DiPietro, at Goddard Space Flight Center. I get a call out of the blue from the payload manager from Johnson Space Center of the shuttle. And he wanted to talk to me about the videotape I had on that mission, what videotape we happen to have. And I called the house, and it was on my tape when I got home. And I called back to talk to him about that. And he just wanted to know what was up and what I was listening on and what I had on my ham radio. When I would go over to this photography studio to pick up some of my work, there were interagency cars right across the street and guys in suits taking pictures of me. And they took pictures of me and my wife in Kansas City when we were at Worlds of Fun. And I told other people about this because I got very skittish about what was going on here. I even told my photographer friend who was running the studio. Then I took down the license number of the vehicle, and it was registered off at Air Force Base. I had Air Force and intelligence officer visit me at my house. This guy wanted to come over and visit my house, and I asked to see if his credentials, even civilian clothes, and he showed me credentials, and it was U.S. Air Force. He was an Air Force officer. And he just wanted to come in and see my ham equipment, so forth and so on. And of course, I can understand that. I've got nothing to hide, so I took him down to the basement and showed him all my stuff. And he's aware of it. When the F-4 Bravos, after they had launched from the aircraft carrier and went up, the only indication I had from listening to the pilots were the same expletives that, what the heck is that? Where did it go? They couldn't see anything except what was on briefly on their conical scan radar just for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then, there was no tally-ho. At first I heard one tally-ho, and then there was, where did it go, is what I would hear,
And what's a tally-ho?
A tally-ho is when a combat air patrol or an aircraft will happen to make visual contact or will make contact with the radar and lock on, and they'll say tally-ho. That is a code for letting the commander or the CO know back on the ship that they have made visual contact and have confirmed that there is a contact there. Now, I heard that come out, and then later, nothing. There were other guys there who, in talking with Mr. Grzinski, who was with the Rosie in '61, the year prior to when I arrived on board. They had a huge UFO flap where this actually came down out of the clouds. Not only lights, but they saw a saucer and their photographs were taken. And we've been trying to get in touch with the photographer who took those photographs. But there were people coming up from the engine room to take a look at this thing, and he saw it. And there were documents that I have seen that refer to the Roosevelt having several instances of UFO flyovers, and particularly after they took on board nuclear weapons. And I was on board when they did take those on for the first time. All these guys walking around with dosimeters, and then Marine Guards, and yeah, they brought on the Alpha 5 Alpha aircraft, and they were replacing the A3 Bravo aircraft, Sky Warrior. And Roosevelt was a very hybrid type of ship. Talked late night over the phone with the sheriff down there and with the farmer and his family. And by the time I got down there, the rain had been letting up, and we arrived there and met the farmer and went out, and he took us down into the field, myself and two associates with all this equipment, a videotape. And we went down in the field, and what lay before us were some haystacks, a sorghum field which was half harvested, and there were some very strange burns in the middle of this field. There was a 70-foot burn, perfect circle, with 6 equally spaced 20-foot burns around the outside perimeter, halfway inside, a 40-foot burn and a 20-foot burn, and down the hill from the creek bed there were 9 what the farmer had referred to hover burns coming up the hill and to these areas. The sorghum field had been irradiated with a straight line, and one side looked like it had been freeze-dried and the other was still stable. And the grass was beige around the outside perimeter of these circles, then a little green, and then it was all depressed on the inside. The granddaughter of this same farmer had been walking out with her brother that morning when we had had the interview with her, when the sheriff was there, had mentioned that they had seen what looked like a silver tent with carnival lights on them that night on the hill, and the farmer and his family had seen lights also, and the son and daughter said, well, Dad, why don't you go down there and check it out? And he said, well, no, I'm not going to go out there. Well, the next morning they went down there after the little girl, and the family called the house about these silver tents with carnival lights because she thought there was some kind of a fair or something going on down there. And they went down there and they found these burns in his field. And that is how one evolves into another. There is a natural step and an evolution of it. But in my first discussion with Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr. and through the mail about some of his descriptors and his father's descriptors of something that looked like plastic fishing line. To me, that's fiber optics. In 1947, CD-ROM discs, computer chips, where is the first wafer-thin proof of who invented it and who patented it? If it came from somewhere else and was given to a large corporation to find its application for military, where we get everything down from anyway eventually. And the ground had been baked in this area rock hard. It had been bisqued. It had been radiated and was rock hard. When the farmer would go out there to disc the area up, the disc would come up over the plug and roll right over the top of it. And it had been hardened. In order for that to occur, and the samples that we had taken, you'd had to have had 1200-degree heat in order for that to have occurred in some of those areas down there. That's a huge microwave. One of the farmers had a sod field, a sod farm, and a plug had been turned up in his field 21 feet by 21 feet by 21 feet, and it was 12 inches deep, and the plug had been turned completely upside down with the grass side down, and rocks were sheared clear off. Another one, a farm pond, the ice was 4 to 6 inches thick and had a perfect circle taken right out of it, and he walked down the farm pond, snow on the ground, ice outside, way below freezing, and there was a little fog hanging over the pond ice, and no particles of ice around anywhere, just ice plug taken right out of the farm pond. The burns on that particular farm in the area now, the sorghum is beginning to come back. The grass in that area predominantly that grows now is growing out not straight up, it's growing out in rosettes and little tufts, which we've taken pictures of. The 70-foot plug in the ground has a 3-inch crack that's 2 feet deep, and that has been essentially filled in by the tilling and the farming that's been going on over the years. But no matter what is planted there, when it grows, it's a different color, and you can still see. And here we are in the year 2000, and I just spoke to the farmer not more than 4 or 5 weeks ago because I knew you were coming here to take this interview. In the scoop that was taken out of the haystack, and I looked in the scope myself at home, and I still have some of those samples, by the way. I'm sure I do, in little metal containers. The cuts, when you look at the cuts in hay, if you cut it with a pair of scissors and you look at it under a microscope, if I could illustrate it this way, in the mind's eye, is like if you take a beehive that has hexagon shapes in the honeycombs and a beehive, and if you take a steak knife and you try to cut the beehive discretely between those cells so you can cut out each honeycomb cell that has a hexagon shape, okay, it's very difficult to do. Now you take and you magnify that 1,000 times, 10,000 times, and you look at the cellular structure of a leaf or a blade of grass, or in this case hay, and you look at it under 500 magnification and you look at the cells, there is no destruction of the cell or the epidermal wall of the cell. There is discrete cutting between the cells. Now even if a surgeon took a laser and went in and cut a vein or try to repair it or something like that, that's one thing. But when you're looking at under a microscope, you have to ask yourself what kind of technology could do that. And the planet is becoming intellectually celibate, in my opinion. People are walking around in a daze. They have no idea what is going on. No idea. Many corporations have been getting, wealthy, and yes, they've been providing humanity as a whole with technological change that benefit us all. But they really aren't sharing the meat and the source of where it all came from, and ultimately they're not sharing the truth about UFOs. They aren't sharing the truth about UFOs. They are real, period.